All right, Ben. You gave us the recap and summation of Inferno's themes last episode. You contrasted Ilyana and Madelyne's story, you examined the villains, you even gave us the unfulfilled backstory that author Chris Claremont had for Mr. Sinister. You should be done with Inferno by now, so how, in Stan Lee's name, are you doing yet another episode about Inferno? Huh? Well, here's the thing, dear listener. We've covered the Inferno crossover, yes, but we only covered the Exterminators, the New Mutants, Uncanny X-Men, and X-Factor tie-in issues. We didn't cover any of the other books involved. Oh yeah, there's more. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 24.16 of the X-Men's Inferno crossover, From Sparks to Ashes, Part 2. The two waves of Inferno that we covered are most definitely the main portion of the crossover. That's the required reading, the meat patty to our Inferno hamburger. But they are not the only portions available at our comic book buffet. Hell, I didn't even cover the other main X comic that was being published at the time. While Louise Simonson had taken over writing the New Mutants and X-Factor comics, Chris Claremont at the time wrote Uncanny X-Men and Excalibur. I've spoken at length about how the X-Men were believed dead by most of the world at the time, including their friends and family. This included former X-Men Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, and Rachel Grey, the alternate reality daughter of Jean Grey, who was going by the codename Phoenix at the time. Fate brought the three together in England, where they teamed up with national hero Captain Britain and his girlfriend, the empathic shapeshifter Megan, in order to found Excalibur. Ostensibly, their goal was to further Charles Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence between man and mutant, but Excalibur acted more like a team of Avengers than a team of X-Men, generally speaking. In terms of tone, Excalibur was designed to be the lighter, more fun complement to the serious, mature storytelling that Claremont employed on Uncanny X-Men. That's not to say that he didn't take his stories there seriously, but Claremont was specifically trying to make a book that was a little bit more fun and a little bit more silly. He and artist Alan Davis often included pop culture references, lampooned other Marvel titles, and put the characters in unsuspectingly dangerous situations, which worked well given the lighthearted tone of the book. In issues 6 and 7, Rachel Grey, who is a powerful telepath like her mother, can feel her little brother, Nathan Christopher, panicking and reaching out for help all the way across the Atlantic in Manhattan. Using her immense telekinesis, Rachel blasts through Excalibur's headquarters, crosses the Atlantic, encounters Madelyne Pryor, and, thinking that she's Jean Grey because, wow, she looks a lot like Jean Grey, she gets smacked around. Rachel then battles a demonically possessed building and gets trapped in the form of a store mannequin by accident. As she stands there, frozen in a wedding dress, who should see her but good old Crotus! Still burned and blackened from what I thought was his death over an Exterminators, he even still has Nastier's spellbook. He recognizes the spark of the Phoenix entity inside of Rachel and plans to marry her, thus tying her power to him. Before he can complete the spell and marriage, though, Nightcrawler shows up with the possessed mannequin that swapped with Rachel, and he smashes the two of them together, restoring Rachel to her body. If you are wondering, because I know that this is a critical thing for everybody out there, yes, Crotus does survive. He is last seen at the end of issue 7, humbled and calling for his master. I can't find another mention of the character online, and the one mention that I did find does not have an issue number, so I am unsure if that actually happened or not. But as far as I'm concerned, Crotus is still out there somewhere in the Marvel Universe. So good for you, Crotus. You are the one bad guy to make it out of this event alive. The rest of Excalibur followed their teammate, and they had their own Inferno adventures. Of particular note for us, though, is a bit of Kitty Pryde's story. When she, Captain Britain, and Megan arrive in Manhattan, Megan's nature causes her to be drawn to Nastier. You see, Megan is an empathic shapeshifter, meaning that she automatically scans the minds of those around her, and she can unconsciously or consciously alter her body to reflect what those minds are seeing. Since she is dating Captain Britain at the time, Megan reflects what he wants in a partner. So she's a beautiful blonde with ample curves and big doe eyes. But occasionally, Nightcrawler would flirt with her because that's just what Nightcrawler does, and her body would then adopt a similar look to his dark blue fur. In this particular instance, though, Megan's powers respond to the Inferno spell, drawing her to Nastier. He then eats her soul, and, as we have seen before, she is left with just the bad parts of herself, becoming the Goblin Princess. In her new role, Megan magically transports Cap and Kitty into a movie where Brian is the bad guy who is trying to hunt Kitty in the style of several horror slasher movies. This goes on for a while until Kitty suddenly, randomly, seemingly, manifests the soul sword and armor of Magik. You might recall that Illyana threw her soul sword into the spiraling light that sucked all of Inferno's demons back to Limbo. When she died, when her timeline corrected itself and Teen Illyana stopped existing, her soul sword and armor went to Kitty Pryde. The pair are best friends, and when they lived at the mansion, they were actually roommates. It's quite an old plotline that whenever Illyana dies, and yeah, I forgot that she actually did die once before, the soul sword moves to her best friend. Kitty then uses its ability to cut through magic in order to free Brian and Megan from the Inferno's influence, restoring them to normal. Save, for some emotional damage. The soul sword would stay with Kitty for years, pretty much not being addressed at all until 1994's Soul Sword trilogy, running through Excalibur issues 83, 84, and 85. The X titles weren't the only books affected by the Inferno. After all, a lot of Marvel's output takes place in New York City, and that city just got possessed by demons. This meant that there were tie-ins for a number of Marvel titles, including the Amazing, Spectacular, and Web of Spider-Man titles, The Avengers, The Mutant Misadventures of Cloak and Dagger, Power Pack, Daredevil, and Fantastic Four. Most of these titles had just 3 tie-in issues running concurrently with Uncanny and X-Factor's main storyline. They did not last as long as something like Exterminators did. I didn't cover these books for the show because none of them have an impact on our main narrative. Even Excalibur, as we just discussed, was really only involved tangentially. Now, that's not to say that Inferno did not have long-lasting impacts on those titles, just that those titles had no impact on Inferno. For example, over in Spider-Man's titles, a supercriminal called the Hobgoblin made a deal with Nastier in order to gain more power. In exchange for his soul, Nastier bonded the Hobgoblin to a random demon. The Hobgoblin quickly found that such a thing was not a good thing for him, and so he had the demon removed. It then took on the general appearance and theming of the Hobgoblin, but with its own mission, that of punishing sinners. It took the name Demogoblin, and has appeared as a Spidey bad guy on and off over the years. He is perhaps most famous for taking part in the Maximum Carnage crossover in the 90s, and appearing in one of Venom's many miniseries from the 90s, a 3-issue book called The Enemy Within. I've always dug the look of the Demogoblin, but he's never managed to latch on as a character. As a bad guy, he just isn't as impressive or noteworthy as previous goblin-based villains like the Green Goblin or the Hobgoblin. And as a good guy, there are just better written and more interesting heroes who punish sinners, like, the Punisher, and surprisingly Ghost Rider. Similarly, over in Power Pack, a long-running bad guy in the book, Douglas Carmody, was turned into a demon by Nastier, and he took the name of the Boogeyman. Once the Inferno passed, Carmody was so crazy that he actually just stayed a demon and cemented his place as one of the Power Pack's greatest enemies. Over in Avengers issues 298 to 300, a new version of the team gathered to fight off the Inferno, including a returning Captain America, Thor, the Eternal called Gilgamesh, Mr. Fantastic, and the Invisible Woman of the Fantastic Four. At one point in their story, Nastier is alerted to the brimming power of the Fantastic Four's son, Franklin Richards, and so he kidnaps the kid as a backup plan in case Madelyne backs out of, killing her own son. The Avengers do rescue Franklin, of course, and the makeshift team officially announces their intentions of staying as the Avengers. At least for a time. For almost all of the tie-ins, the majority of their story is how the heroes respond to the demonically animated objects of New York. Avengers issue 298 is actually a great example of this, as we see the Avengers' butler and stalwart friend, Jarvis, traveling through the city and doing his own part in fighting off murderous telephones and cars and the like. It's a nice reminder that you don't need superpowers to help people. It also shows that while Jarvis did not play a role in stopping the threat of Inferno, he still saved lives. No heroic effort is wasted, no matter how big or small. The idea that the main event of a crossover is happening in a specific book or a series of books, but it is still affecting other titles while not being affected by those titles, feels like a more modern idea to me. But clearly it isn't. I don't know why I think that older crossovers were somehow more streamlined, as they obviously weren't. A crossover is a crossover, after all. It is a nice way of showing the size and scope of the Inferno, but I have to admit, if I was an Avengers fan at the time, buying just the Avengers ongoing series, would I give a crap about this story happening over in the X-Books? Would I feel compelled to pick them up just to better understand the threat of Nastier? And then when I read the event and see he's not even the main threat, well, I can't help but think that I would feel a little bit cheated. In terms of its overall balance as a crossover, I don't know if Inferno did very well. While I don't own every Inferno crossover issue, I do own the Power Pack, Excalibur, and Cloak and Dagger issues because I've put together individual collections of those books. But, as you can see, there isn't really much of an incentive to pick up the others as an X fan. If you do want to read those books, then by all means, please do. But I do not have much of an interest in that particular era of the Avengers, Fantastic Four, or Daredevil, so I'm pretty okay with leaving them just where they are. As I've said, I do have some slight interest in the Spider-Man comics, as I've always liked Demogoblin's design and vaguely anti-hero-esque status, but I really don't care enough to hunt those books down. These various Inferno tie-in comics, actually even the main X-Books themselves, generally run somewhere between $5 on the cheapest end to $15, $20, $25 on the more expensive end, especially for the first appearance of the demonized Hobgoblin. So collecting this entire event in the floppy individual issues can get a little bit pricey. When I bought my copies, I was paying just $2 an issue for near mint comics, but that was also 20 years ago when I was a kid. Curse you, the inevitable march of time. There are collected editions of Inferno, if that is more your thing. There is a single volume hardback, which is really nice, that collects the main X-Books, and I believe there is one collecting all of the tie-ins as well, which is kinda neat. Marvel doesn't usually give tie-ins that kind of treatment. The issues aren't totally out of reach, and of course there are also digital options, both legal and illegal, if that's your thing and you're interested. The events of Inferno go on long past the end of the crossover and the scope of its tie-ins. After her de-aging and de-characterization, Illyana goes back to live with her parents in Russia. They're killed in X-Men Volume 2, issues 17 through 19, and little Illyana then returns to America and stays at the X-Mansion. She is a background character for a while until Uncanny X-Men 304, where she dies in a really heartbreaking issue as a result of the mutant-specific virus, the Legacy virus. For a very long time, that's it for Illyana. Eventually, during the reality-altering House of M event, an alternate reality Illyana was created. From Limbo, which remember is a realm outside of time and space, the demon lord Belasco sees Illyana alive, and he wants his girl back. So a new version of the character was created in 2007. A story arc in New X-Men called A Quest for Magik saw the character recreated by Belasco, essentially a magical clone. But when Belasco resurrected Illyana, yeah, he created her body, but the act of bringing her back did not also bring back her soul. The very thing that Belasco treasured her for was gone. She was no longer something precious to him, she was just another monster. But that version of the character stayed around, basically a modern recreation of teen Illyana, complete with all of her angst, but now derived from a new direction. Where classic Illyana hated her past and how it had shaped her, this new Illyana viewed herself as a monster without a soul. There was no temptation to be a monster, she literally was a monster. 2008's 4-issue miniseries X Infernus picked up where A Quest for Magik left off. It ends with Illyana leaving Limbo and returning to her mutant family, the New Mutants. This idea is then moved over into the New Mutants Volume 3, which launched in 2009. Issue 15 of that book kicks off a story arc called The Fall of the New Mutants, which runs until issue 20, when it becomes The Rise of the New Mutants. This story actually picks up on a long-forgotten bit of X history, namely, the Inferno babies. Nastier had his goblins kidnap 13 quote-unquote children of power, aka mutant babies, as part of the pentagram, which held open the portal to Limbo. The New Mutants and the Exterminators saved those babies and then turned them over to the US government, trusting that they would return them to their homes and families. Well, they didn't. Having been shocked by the threat of a literal hell dimension invading Earth, the military set about investigating Limbo, establishing a beachhead there, and attempting to pacify the realm. They studied the Limbo babies, and in the strange time passage of Limbo, those kids grew up as tortured, often mutilated, cold-blooded soldiers. They're almost as demonic as the natives of Limbo in a lot of ways. This is a really good story arc, easily one of the best to come from this particular volume of New Mutants. After that, Illyana joined the X-Men, becoming a standard feature of the team, and she has largely been a cast member ever since. She has studied magic with Doctor Strange, she was actually possessed by the Phoenix for a little while, she is a teacher at the Strange Academy, she's appeared in the latest Midnight Suns miniseries, and she serves as a war captain on Krakoa in the latest era of the X-Books. She is even currently a member of the X-Men in 2021's latest volume of X-Men, which also sees the latest story to pick up where the Inferno left off. The Dark Web crossover. But Illyana isn't the only Inferno-related character coming back for that crossover. Oh no! As part of the new Krakoan era, mutants have found a way to standardize resurrection for themselves, guaranteeing their eventual inheritance of Earth from humanity. One of the mutants brought back as part of this was Madelyne Pryor. So let's see what she's been up to since she died. After her attempted murder-suicide with Jean Grey, Maddie actually stayed gone for quite some time. She wouldn't be seen again until 1995's X-Man, issue 5, where she was recreated as a psychic ghost with physical form. I am not going to get into the knot of continuity that is X-Man and his connection to Maddie, but she was an on and off again character throughout the run, sometimes an ally, sometimes a bad guy. This version of Maddie was forgotten when X-Man was cancelled, left as a psychic ghost, unable to affect the world any longer. Another iteration of Maddie played a very pivotal part in 1998's ongoing series called Mutant X. This comic was one of my first alternate reality comics, and I have a lot of personal love for it. The basic idea of the comic is that when Magneto joined the X-Men, a group of the X-Men left the team in protest. This team, now called the Six, because it's got an X in it and it's made up of 6 team members, was led by Alex Summers, aka Havoc, and his wife, Madelyne. This reality in general is much darker than the standard Marvel universe, featuring much more monstrous versions of classic X-Men like Storm, Beast, and Archangel, who are now called Bloodstorm, Brute, and the Fallen. It doesn't take long for Maddie to start to go crazy, and by the end of the first year, she was trying to take over the world. I'm not going to go into much more detail regarding Mutant X, as it is on my list of books to cover for the show someday, and I just want y'all to understand that Inferno is a huge influence on this comic. It has darker, more demonic threats overall, it absolutely stars Madelyne Pryor as a villainess, and it features Alex Summers as her husband, lover, and almost a reluctant hero, as he is the one person who can't seem to be controlled by her and actually sees her for the danger that she is. The first year of Mutant X is pretty solid in its overall storytelling, and then it really starts to go off into crazy alternate reality stories and kind of goes off the rails, but I have a lot of love for this book. Mutant X and X-Man both ended in 2001, and Maddie faded away into the mists of history. And she stayed there for almost 10 years, until the X-Men moved to San Francisco with Uncanny X-Men issue 501 in 2008. This issue saw the ghost of Madelyne Pryor mess with the X-Men, although I cannot for the life of me remember why she was doing so. I mean, I think they just did it because she's evil. Anyways, Maddie chills out for a little bit until issue 508, where she gathered together a group of supervillain ladies, forming a team called the Sisterhood, and then she attempted to possess the corpse of the then-dead Jean Grey. Cyclops outsmarted Madelyne, though, moving Jean's corpse beforehand, and the fake body that it was replaced with burned out, leaving Maddie as nothing but a ghost once again. 2014 saw a new incarnation of the Sisterhood band together, and this time, they actually did manage to successfully resurrect Madelyne. She immediately drops off the map once the story is finished, not showing up again in comics until 2020's Hellions series, written by author Zeb Wells, who is also the same person who wrote The Fall and Rise of the New Mutants. In Hellions, Maddie had taken over Sinister's secret lab in Nebraska, and she had been torturing the Marauders, just as a thing to do. The Hellions, which included former Marauder Greycrow and Maddie's ex, Havoc, stop her, but in the process she is killed. Again. Thankfully, mutant kind has solved for death at this point, and they are able to basically just regrow bodies and use psychic memory files to restore people to life. When Havoc brings this up to the ruling council, though, they don't like the idea of bringing Madelyne Pryor back to life. She is, after all, not a natural life form. She was a clone to begin with, and as such, she wasn't really a person. I think it is worth noting that Mr. Sinister is one of the people on this council. This rejection greatly upsets Havoc, who pushes the council to bring her back. There are other X characters, notably X-23, a female clone of Wolverine, who get resurrected regularly. Why does she count as a person, but Maddie doesn't get to count as a person? And if you're going to sit here and say that it's, well, because she's a bad guy, you're sitting on a council with Mr. Sinister. Everything bad about Maddie came from him, you hypocrites. The woman finally does get brought back to life, but surprisingly, Madelyne isn't really happy about it. From her perspective, the council didn't bring her back because she is a living being and she is owed life the same as everyone else on the island. Instead, they just brought her back to make Alex happy. She's just a thing to be awarded to a man to make him feel better. So she does not resume a relationship with Alex, but she does meet Ilyana Rasputin for the first time, who offers Maddie the chance to rule Limbo. After what I think is a much too long of a story arc in the New Mutants called The Labors of Magik, Ilyana does indeed hand the ruling keys of Limbo over to Maddie, hoping to provide the woman with a life outside of the X-Men and Mr. Sinister, and just all of their bullshit. As a survivor of devastating trauma, as someone made by a man in order to fulfill a role, Ilyana sympathizes with Maddie's situation. It took 20-something years for these two halves of the Inferno to finally meet, and I love that when they do, there's almost an unspoken bond between them. As the Goblin Queen once again, this time literally, Maddie immediately sets out on a new plan in order to get back what was hers. After an encounter with the newly evil clone of Spider-Man, going by the name Chasm, they put together a plan to get revenge on those who wronged them. Chasm wanted Spider-Man's memories for his own, believing that the parts of him that were missing can only be acquired by stealing them from Spidey. Madelyne, on the other hand, wanted the missing years of her life back. After her death, her son was raised by Cyclops and Jean Grey, creating a life that really should have been hers. Together, the pair launched a new demonic assault on New York, drawing in the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Venom in a crossover called The Dark Web, written by author Zeb Wells. You can tell that somebody really liked Inferno when they were a kid. Obviously, Dark Web is influenced by Inferno, but it has a pretty nice ending to it if you are a fan of Madelyne Pryor. Not so much if you're a fan of Chasm. I don't want to spoil anything here, as it's a pretty recent story, but overall, I really did enjoy Dark Web. Wells does a really great job of treating Madelyne like a person. He is probably the closest author to handling her like Claremont did, and he provides a lot of depth and nuance to her. Almost every other version of Maddie that you read, who I guess is actually probably just like the psychic ghost Maddie from X-Men, just moving from book to book over like 20 years. God, that's weird. Almost every other version of the character just has that psychotic one-note evil for evil's sake personality going on. Speaking of that personality, there is one more Maddie story of note, but it kind of doesn't count as a Maddie story. In 2015, author Jonathan Hickman blew up the Marvel Multiverse in the Secret Wars event. The surviving pieces of reality were knitted together into one planet called Battleworld, and each reality within Battleworld was its own district or zone. One of those war zones was a Limbo-possessed Manhattan, and its story was told in a 5-issue miniseries called Inferno. Battleworld is eventually destroyed and the multiverse is restored, but the Madelyne Pryor of Battleworld survived. 2016's All New X-Men Volume 2 saw her move from her Battleworld to the 616 reality with issue 15. She fought the team of X-Men in that book and was beaten, but she was not killed. She fled the scene, and as far as I can tell, she is still out there. I bring this up because both the Inferno miniseries and Volume 2 of All New X-Men are written by the same author, a man named Dennis Hopeless, so he clearly enjoyed writing Maddie enough that he decided to bring her along for the ride. This version of the character is blatantly evil. Like, OG Maddie had her problems, but there was always hope that she would come to her senses, you know? And while the Ghost Maddie was certainly power-hungry, she wasn't always fighting the X-Men every month or torturing innocent bystanders. She wanted a life and independence, sure, but who doesn't want those things? But this version of Maddie, 2015 Maddie, She's got a sword made of fire, she's magically mutated Nightcrawler in order to act as her teleporting steed, she has the horns of the Darkchild, and she pretty gleefully invades South Beach. This character has that psychotic evil for evil's sake thing going on, but with a dash of fun that makes her a much more enjoyable villainess. As far as I can find, this version of the character has not shown up at all since she moved into the 616 universe, which is why I say that she kind of doesn't count. If no one's going to tell stories about her, then no one needs to care about her. Sim goes on to appear in a lot of Limbo stories. He's kind of like the main fixture there. Nastier does appear one more time, I think it's in X Infernus, where he's basically shown to be a slave to Magik in, I think, one panel, and we have not seen him since. All of the intelligence and conniving that the character once had is not present in the one panel that he appears in. Limbo, as itself, of course, has continued to be explored on and off over the decades, in stories like the previously covered on this very podcast, X-Men Dark Sun miniseries, and its follow-up, the Magik miniseries. Y'all might remember that Sim actually showed up in the Magik series as a surprise bad guy. Of course, Mr. Sinister has gone on to influence several storylines and cement his place in X-villain history. Marvel is actually doing a self-contained crossover called The Sins of Sinister in 2023, running through 3 of the X books, which is just built around the guy. Sinister has changed a lot over the years since his debut and from Claremont's original concept, but his penchant for playing with genes, clones, and manipulating people remains. Oh my god, I wonder if the reason Claremont had Sinister do so much cloning stuff was because he was playing with genes, Genes, but he was also playing with Jean, Gean, Grey. Whoa. I don't know if I just had a breakthrough or if that's stupid, but whoa. It was after I recorded our last episode that a different interesting thought occurred to me. In Uncanny X-Men 243, Claremont devotes a full page to Jean Grey's angry reaction to Mr. Sinister's invasion of their lives. He's ransacked the mansion, destroyed anything of meaning to them, and just made a right mess of things. Claremont does this in-universe to explain why and how Sinister knew so much about the X-Men, understanding them better than almost anyone else that they have faced up to this point. That idea stood out to me. That Jean Grey, specifically, out of all the characters at the X-Mansion, had such a visceral reaction to having their lives insulted. Their lives were literally and physically torn apart and strewn all around them so that this guy could reach his goals. In universe, we are obviously talking about Mr. Sinister, and Jean has Madelyne Pryor's absorbed memories in her mind now, so her anger at this happening makes a lot of sense. It's not just that Jean is upset, but Madelyne is upset too. But out of universe, it really sounds like we're talking about Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter was Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time of publication, and he is the main reason that the Inferno even happened. Shooter basically forced the authors working for him to bring Jean Grey back from the dead. This damaged Cyclops' character, it damaged Madelyne's character, and put them on the road to the Inferno. Shooter didn't care about the lives of the characters involved, their personhood within the minds of the authors and fans. He just cared about making money. He cared about achieving his goals, even if it meant ruining the lives of the characters involved. Jean's visceral reaction suddenly makes a little bit more sense. If Sinister is a stand-in for Shooter, then he is the one that she is really upset with. Shooter is the one who played with their lives like a child with toys. Shooter is the one who didn't care about them. Shooter is the reason she came back from the dead at all. And I wonder if Jean's anger isn't a little bit of Claremont's anger, directed at his boss. This also makes Inferno's third act switch to Sinister as the bad guy make a bit more sense too. I postulated last episode that Claremont and Simonson were shifting the blame for the events of Inferno, first from Nastier to Madelyne, and then from Madelyne to Sinister, in an attempt to salvage what they could of then sympathizable characters Cyclops and Maddie. Those characters made mistakes, yes, but they didn't mean to make mistakes. They weren't these grand evil people, they were human beings. The only reason that they made those mistakes at all was this guy, Mr. Sinister. And out of universe, this guy is Mr. Shooter. In Jim Shooter's defense, Inferno is a legendary storyline. It affected the X-Books for years. Hell, it still affects them to this day. That is something that might not have happened if Cyclops and Madelyne just got their happy ending and raised their baby. Both Claremont and Simonson have said in interviews that Madelyne didn't really become an interesting character to them until Jean Grey came back and they were forced to shift everything that they were doing with her. If Jean had never come back from the dead, then the face of X fandom would also likely be totally different. After all, imagine X-Men the Animated Series, but without Jean Grey in it. Dozens of stories in the comics may not have happened. We may not have gotten Cable. Who knows how Illyana's story would have played out if Inferno didn't happen? Shooter's goal, as editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, was to sell comic books. It was not to treat the characters like people. That is not the job. It's often said in the world of writing that you have to kill your darlings, meaning that an author cannot protect the characters in their story from bad things happening to them. A writer has to make bad things happen for an entertaining story to be told at all. And thanks to Shooter mandating the resurrection of Jean Grey, I would say that we have gotten a lot of entertainment. Next week will be the comic book breakdown traditional Skip Week, where I try to recover from banging out insightful podcast episodes on a weekly basis. There will be a catching up episode where I'm going to talk about some major changes that have gone on in my life, and then the week after we'll start to explore something from DC Comics. It's been 4 years since we wrapped up Secret Six, my personal favorite DC comic of all time, and it has been 3 years since I finished out Superman's Our Worlds at War crossover. Given all the attention that I have paid to Marvel and CrossGen in the meantime, I figured that DC is due a little bit of love. I just need to figure out which book I want to cover first. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me, to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.